As you are likely aware, we weren't the only ones playing Saviour in the snow. While Site 107 and 120 had slipped into oblivion, new craft were landing all along the coast every day, heading inland. We could hear the roaring engines of snowcat convoys, rugged caravan vehicles, assembled now by the Royal Society. I gathered the noble fellows had taken charge of a great many industries at home, directing them towards Greenland's rich innards. Some of them came to our docks to assemble their equipment before heading in. Lots of military types. They said to expect a lot more. I asked what they thought of this business about the sea freezing over, and they were astoundingly chipper about it all. They, in fact, were delighted with the prospect, for their steam vehicles could drive all the way from London in that case. I hadn't thought of that. I could take Jasper and walk home if worst came to worst. Perhaps even have Pen and Syl prepare a sled. Seeing all the red-faced Jacks was reassuring at the very least. This traffic came to profit us when our hunters realized that some of the materials being taken inland had been left behind. The sort of thing too precious to leave by accident, we imagined. Prefabricated generator parts, the very things our hands were trying to build and install at that time. A boost to the schedule, and ample payment for rent of our docks, I thought. It was vital, really, to have pilfered that salvage, for the pace of work was sinking in tandem with those thermometer readings. It was not so much the mechanical aspect of the cold, but the mental. The tension regarding our impending entrapment in ice was growing, and the hands supposedly wished to be away before it happened. Impossible, even on an idealized schedule, and contrary to the terms of their employment besides. That said, their desire to be away with nothing but their life to show for it was hard to argue back into the box. That Salvaging was on the 29th day of our visit, notable also as the one where the daily temperature high did not break zero for the first time. Winter rolled on closer, with the cold being only the first swing of the pendulous tumult the frost promised. The workers were roused to strike again by the tumours within, then settled down once they'd had lunch. Yes, it's called hunger, children, and you need not be so stirred by it. It was as if they believed every itch on their body was my responsibility, and the disruption to the work this bantering caused was intolerable. Our overseers kept exceptionally close watch on the grunting conversations of the hands. Its true content was hard to discern at comfortable distance, so it was more akin to observing the patterns of apes. A simple log was all we needed. By charting which numbers interacted with which other numbers, we could determine a few choice records that were linked to the greatest number of their row mates. These were the ringleaders, vital intelligence expertly gathered. It was acted upon with the sublime discretion of the formless angels. A snowcat came by from Site 40, a little base called Winterhome, supposedly a refuge for Londoners, looking for a crate of misplaced generator parts. Those parts were innocently arranged on our production belts around the pit, appearing freshly assembled. No alarm was raised. The snowcat was not driven off empty-handed though, thanks to the smartest of our engineers. Number 233 must have climbed into the back, forgotten entirely where he was, and gone to sleep, hitting his head on some tool or other located in the compartment with him. A silly man. With a simple score across the page of my book, the inflammatory connections between many other numbers were quickly severed. Predictably, 233's absence was noted by the closest links, mostly 3-digit numbers, then the outlier, 52. Now then, our task was simple. I ordered Syl to make a grand show of searching the entire site and its collaring escarpments, permitting all hands to even cease their work to partake in the detailed search. It was a man, a soul, a human being that was lost, my engineers proclaimed. Then, on time, after the 4 hours I had rationed for this farce, they suddenly declared the search fruitless and hurried everyone back to their places. By then the hands had seen no trace of the missing number, or of any cause for its sudden subtraction. Superb work. Euphemia never knew, and even seemed happy when I returned from debriefing Syl and company. She declared her certainty that 233 would show up safe and sound. Seeing her made my satisfaction feel awfully poisonous. You see, my traitor mind imagined that Effie had been the one lost, inviting me to enjoy the feelings of despair that one supposes some in our camp were drinking their way through. Worse, I thought that were circumstances only partially deviant, she could have been the ringleader of the damned herself. I was right to keep her still at my desk. She was too good for the world. It was healthy to be kept indoors by that time, for the ice was making itself quite welcome. On the morning of the 31st day it snowed heavily, which changed our landscape for good. The temperature was not to exceed melting point during the day for as far ahead as anyone cared to divine. It was jolly cold. It became a matter of rationing to preserve coal for the machinery, with the mouths of our burners growing ever hungrier. One solution was to better preserve the heat already in production with superior accommodation. Obviously impossible broadly speaking, but we'd materials for at least some effort to be made. Therefore our night shifters were directed to begin construction of brick houses for the IEC staff, who were at that time clustered in shacks at the base of the headquarters. The barracks on the ground floor had overflowed with the steady flow of fresh eyes from England. This, I hoped, would provide the auxiliary benefit of fostering a more clean divide between the engineers and the hands, preventing any more leakage of ruinous sympathies. The hands, at least, would be awed by that which they had not earned, and subconsciously be spurred on to be worthy in our eyes. Simple magic tricks, known even in the times of the Roman castra. Perhaps not even required, for the hands were crushed already by the misery of the surprisingly missed 233, and more literally by the weight of snow on their canvas. Their idle plodding was mired into a barely recognizable trudge, as if labouring with ball and chain. The actual work we were all being tortured for had ground almost to a halt. We were supposed to be assembling the generator core. No, to be accurate, we were supposed to have already assembled it by the IEC schedule. However, the cocktail of cold, nihilism and faulty scaffolding had us floundering, while still taking attrition by gas and accident. Most days 10 to 20 of the hands were abed on one medical excuse or another, keeping them in that suboptimal state of being close enough to death to be useless, yet still drawing supply into their rasping gullets. I did my best to trust the doctor's word that this was all intractably required. Some work was miraculously completed. This was the point in the process where we were to deviate from the original schematics in order to account for Euphemia's alterations. It was a system that allowed the insides of the generator core to be violently emptied of air and then sealed, strangling any pillaging flame. The machines that did this were a grand chore to attach to the round body of the core, and most of the engineers were against it, albeit bashfully. Effie had the hands firmly on her side, which only gave more reason for me to oblige her. I do wonder, though, if I was inviting sabotage from her peers. The engineers proposed all manner of additions on top of the fire dampener, which were, I gather, methods to replace parts of the circulatory mechanism with steam exchangers, which by careful arrangement would render parts of the planned piping obsolete. It would bypass some of the machine when in operation, and thus afford us the chance to bypass those parts' construction. The only reason we hadn't planned for all this was that it was liable to melt and/or combust against the shell of the core. Euphemia's innovation cut the risks involved, and the cut to the work needed to achieve our goals was just the thing the rigor-mortised hands needed. The proper course was veiled in mist, so we burned our possessions to light a new path. The IEC, or Royal Society, only wanted to hear that the work was done, not how large an explosion it was likely to cause when in operation. Therefore, this shortcut was sure to please. My only concern was for the weight we were placing on the fate of humanity, although I had been far too liberal to pretend that a perfect end result was all that mattered. Such is the mind of misery. I am not ashamed. I bathed in misery all about every day. Whenever I had to cross the pit side to reach the engineer's hall, I saw the animal desperation in the hands. They could not bear to look at me, knowing what they had become. There was not much to see, with hats upon scarves upon coats upon boots. I was dressed as a similar blur of animal hair to the hands, since it was they manufacturing these impromptu garments through their cottage crafts. I pined for my collection at Connaught, and I just know it pined for me also. Well over 1,000 miles. We'd certainly need a sled, but who would pull it? Pen and Syl weren't what they used to be. Effie would probably volunteer, being a barbarian in Angel's Masquerade. One could always rummage through the hands, but you wish to be certain in such a critical matter. The aforementioned Desperation came to a head on the morning of day 33. I was alerted to another demonstration of hubris at the generator, and noticed from my window that some of the bastards were throwing off their record collars. Did they think it would make them disappear if they stamped their number into the snow? It was a worse tantrum than usual, and Syl brought me the plant du jour. They were terribly afraid of death. Yes, simple as that. Having stewed news of the freeze for sufficiently long, they speculated that any promise of rescue from the IEC was bunkum. They had come far. Some must have pieced on the notion that the IEC had a strong motivation to leave everyone here after promising all that pay. I was being summoned to answer for the company, as if I represented them. They just needed someone to explain everything. So I did. It was like a sermon. I stood on a ledge circling the generator core, from which I could project myself down onto the 50 or more moaners kicking away snow. I told them that I personally believed the Royal Society, and fully expected to be utterly iced in by the same time next week. Further, I said that I had personally never known the IEC to possess icebreakers, or to be able to cope with changes in circumstance of this magnitude. However, I salved all this with the assurance that all would be free to go once their contracts were done, and I would sign for each hand an invoice that would allow them to draw their pay from the IEC at Liverpool. They were all vocally convinced that reaching Liverpool was impossible, so I shouted down that all would be able to sled wherever they pleased. This confused them. They couldn't imagine whether it was true or not, which clogged their complaints. This was the time when some rousing speech was called for on my part. However, I had to cut my time at the podium short to escape the vapours rising below the core. It was quite discomforting to feel one's mind lighten and my stomach audibly turned. It also made my mouth water, which the doctors claimed was the first time they had noted that symptom. Different symptoms for different breeds, as ever. In the aftermath of my anticlimactic departure, the hands kept up their rah-rah and did not even mimic their paid professions. I had the overseer simply drag them all off to work away from the pit for the time being. There were always parts to process and tools to maintain, those sorts of ancillary tasks. Unscheduled but not unneeded work. Yes, just what the IEC abhorred. I was told that if work resumed immediately at optimal pace, we would still miss the deadline for completion. Extraordinary measures were needed, I told the overseers, and of course they knew what I meant. As they set off for their work, I set off for mine, to inform Penn of a new ration arrangement. Over the previous week, we had stockpiled a collection of anesthetics for the infirmary, billed to serve the 1,000 or so shivering wrecks due to be delivered on opening night. However, one needed only a passing knowledge of the latest in medical science to know of the invigorating alternative use of this Incan coca extract, the cocaine. A small lozenge mixed into morning broth had quite the effect on the human body. The need for food, rest, and rich air was diminished, while the muscles lightened and the vapours cleared. It was ideal for freezing conditions. I had made a habit of taking a half dose with lunch, preferring my mornings to be contemplative. Jasper was not allowed them, on account of the useless mood it put him in. I knew, though, that the hands would take better to it. The syndications had plenty of testimony on the effect. There was some risk of death by complication or coca frenzy, yet, as I've explained, that was hardly a relevant concern in the circumstances. As for the depletion of the anesthetic stock, the IEC wasn't going to ask, and I wasn't going to answer. Better hands alive now than idlers later, after all. The next morning, everyone got back to work. Another of the rotten hands had been gracefully removed from play in the night. and the overseers performed a telling off to the rest for letting their comrade desert them. They were in an optimistic mood about it though. Cocaine permits this, even as the thermometer bottomed at -20. The generator itself, already cycling the hot air from below, remained ice-free, while the rest of the camp was hiding under an off-white Yule blanket. The next order of business was a commendation for Euphemia. I had not the outright authority to grant imperial orders or anything of the like. However, I was permitted to distribute company medals. These were completely farcical, I judged, until I saw how Euphemia beamed at the news. Recognition is all the cocaine youth needs, I proverbed to myself. The occasion to mark was the successful field test of her fire suppression system, which that day was found to be quite a boon. The core had been engulfed in flames, for reasons the overseers pursued by gripping interrogation, and was hence doused by Effie's strangulation machine. Only 10 hands were burned, a dozen inside the core got a nasty shock when they had to skip a few breaths during the strangulation, and a grand sum of 0 were directly killed. My record book was very clean, far more than it needed to be to show up the other sites, whose record books were at that time either not utilized or were too blood-soaked to read. It didn't do the work any favors though, having parts mauled by flame. At least the main damage was done to the most replaceable parts, the hands. I say this to obtusely draw focus onto their ongoing petitions to me, which now were so terse and direct that I was certain they had help writing them. A body of them, perhaps 1/4, had made their mark on a script to terminate their contract with the IEC. Ah yes, they had found their senses. Indeed, anyone was free to terminate their contract, and from one moment to another, all power the company had would evaporate like so much boiled mercury. Their plan was to negotiate passage on a ship before the Great Freeze. Not my responsibility if that was their legal will, although their deaths would be almost certain, since I wouldn't be feeding them or tolerating their presence on company property. Perhaps they could shout at the ships from the cliffs. Well, this matter faded away, simply because I had no choice but to agree to their termination request, and in turn they had no choice but to actually prorogue their expedition in order to eat, which in turn had them hard at work to earn it. At least it kept them quiet. They were dreaming now not of the money, but of the mythical better life across the sea, a hand tradition, and one never so misguided as at that time. It helped their focus at least, and one additional rabble-rouser was rumoured to have gone home on a ship already. Where his body was truly disposed of, I do not know. What I do suspect is that the hands were wise to our scrutiny of their every move, and deathly afraid of what a mistake would mean. A superb arrangement, for which I asked Syl to pick out 3 chiefs for those cheap medals. The recourse the hands were taking, though, was most ingenious, above them so far that how could I have any doubt that they had collaborators? They were exchanging their safety bands with one another, such that each individual was seen at different times with different numbers. This made it very difficult to identify and rectify broken elements among them, and it goes without saying that my safety log was suddenly thrown into utter disrepute, if the lack of deaths noted was not already enough to render it unbelievable. Euphemia saw me closing the log with an emotional snap, and asked after the cause. I looked her right in the eyes, ready to indict her for conspiracy against me. Her crest fell at what must have been my ghastly expression, and I was poisoned immediately by fear for her affections. I just said that the hands wished to leave. She shook her head and replied that most wished to stay. So she knew something of all this. I was spared the decision of whether to play it overseer myself with her, when the telegraphy machine chirped and sputtered to life. Effie dutifully transcribed the signal with practiced speed. It was the IEC, with their latest cantankerous bulletin, generous with its dire predictions and violent in its assignment of blame. They were infuriated by my latest report, specifically that the generator core was still not finished. I had been forced to tell them about the fire to secure Effie's reward, although its existence was not verifiable. They took the chance to threaten me with replacement by a more male alternative, an alteration that they must have been itching to achieve. I knew for a fact this would not happen, by simple virtue of what was sent later in the very same telegraph. It was the newest data on the freeze, summarizable simply as such. We had 2 days. The last ships likely to make it to us were just departing England, after which there would eventually be a convoy to deliver the evacuees. Neither a method of transit for this convoy, nor the mythical icebreaker were mentioned. It was a weight off my mind in a fashion. The IEC were essentially admitting that we would not receive the full sum of parts for the generator on account of this icy siege. Therefore, what could be expected of me had to be shrunk. Later, the engineers decided that we would be able to get it to partially working order thanks to the Winterhome parts we'd levied. I wasn't so concerned about that, since it was more their remit than mine at this juncture. I was concerned that I might die. I was shivering with fear at the thought of the ice, not knowing what it might do to the wavering minds of the crew. I asked Euphemia quite candidly if she thought we were going to be alright. She said we would. Jasper looked at me with promise, although unwilling to leave the side of the radiator. I decided to believe them both, in all matters. It was simple, a gambler's joy. Let the rudders swing free in the last of the liquid sea, I dreamed. We would make it home, we musketeers of the whining radiator and whirring computation box. Anything further to this was unthinkable, and thus remained in the unstirred ether. If only the ice could enclose my mind from the world, how happy we would be in our little room, I mused. I smiled at Effie's face and awaited the last days.